Never underestimate human sweat. Seriously. Because this story is about exactly that. About how the sweat of one completely ordinary man, well, mostly ordinary, caused an intergalactic diplomatic incident. Woke up instincts that had been asleep for millions of years inside an alien species. And somehow got him a girlfriend. Actually, 2 girlfriends. But we'll get to that later. It all started with Tomos Matter. Not exactly the kind of name you expect from a legendary hero. But Tomos was a professional bodyguard and former combat veteran. 1.85 meters of muscle, scars, and the kind of eyes people get after seeing too many bad things. The kind of man who walks into a room and instantly notices every exit, every object that could become a weapon, and every person who might become a threat. His new assignment sounded simple. Protect High Scholar Oruza, an important diplomat from the Odal Tyran species. And before we continue, you need to understand what the Odal Tyran are. Because without that, nothing that happens later will make sense. Imagine a civilization so advanced that they haven't had wars for millions of years. So intellectual that they see emotions as a biological defect. So controlled that even their blinking follows mathematically calculated patterns. The Odal Tyran looked humanoid, but their skin slightly changed color depending on their internal emotional state. They had huge violet eyes. Perfect posture. Perfect speech. Perfect control. And beneath all that elegance, an unbelievable level of arrogance. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that assumes superiority the same way humans assume gravity exists. To them, it was simply scientific fact. And Oruza was the perfect example of her species. Tall. Elegant. Every movement looked carefully choreographed. Even the way she turned her head looked rehearsed. When she spoke, it sounded like every word had been selected from a catalogue of perfect sentences. And she treated Tomos the same way she treated the automatic lighting system in her room. Useful. Necessary. But fundamentally unimportant. Their conversations during the first few weeks were painfully boring. Bodyguard Matter. My schedule indicates a diplomatic meeting in Sector 7. Proceed. Understood. That was it. End of interaction. Tomos escorted her everywhere. Oruza pretended he barely existed. He watched for danger. She negotiated trade agreements so boring they could probably put rocks to sleep. It was just another job. Until the gym incident. See, humans have physical needs. We need movement. We need exercise. We need to sweat. It's primitive, sure. But it's what we are. And Tomos had spent nearly 3 weeks aboard the station without proper training because he was constantly on duty. So one morning, while Oruza was busy with 4 hours of scheduled meditation, Tomos finally went down to the station gym. The place was tiny. Mostly designed for species that rarely used it. Because most aliens aboard the station considered physical exercise barbaric. To them, intentionally exhausting yourself made absolutely no sense. Tomos had been training for about an hour. Weights, push-ups, treadmill sprints, sweating heavily like a normal human being does during intense exercise. Liters of sweat. Thick, salty, full of everything the human body releases under stress and effort. And unfortunately, the gym ventilation system was not built for humans. Most alien species didn't sweat. They used other cooling systems. So nobody had ever considered installing strong air extraction. Slowly, the air inside the gym became thicker, warmer, heavier, until the entire place basically smelled like concentrated Tomos. That was the exact moment the door opened. Oruza stepped inside with her usual perfect posture, holding a data tablet. Her meditation session had ended earlier than expected. She needed to update her bodyguard about changes in tomorrow's diplomatic schedule. What happened next occurred so fast that Tomos barely processed it. Oruza took 2 steps into the room, then stopped instantly. Her enormous violet eyes widened so much that the iris almost disappeared. Her skin changed from calm blue-gray to deep purple. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. And then, she ran. Actually ran. High Scholar Oruza, representative of one of the most emotionally controlled civilizations in the galaxy. turned around and sprinted down the hallway like Tomas was some kind of monster. Tomas stood there holding a dumbbell, completely confused. For several seconds he just stared at the empty doorway. What the hell was that? His first thought was that maybe he had accidentally insulted her culture. Maybe exercising in front of an odal tyrant was offensive. Maybe sweat was considered disgusting. Honestly, that would make sense. At that moment, even he felt disgusting. So he shrugged and kept training. Meanwhile, inside her private quarters, Oruza was having a complete biological crisis. She had locked herself inside her room. Her breathing was unstable. Her pulse dangerously elevated. And worst of all, her mind could not stop replaying the exact moment she inhaled the air inside that gym. That smell. That impossible smell. No, she told herself. This is not happening. This is a temporary biological malfunction. A sensory error. Nothing more. But her skin remained dark purple. Her hands trembled slightly. And somewhere deep inside her brain, in regions evolution should have erased millions of years ago, something ancient had just awakened. Oruza spent the next several hours meditating, rationalizing, analyzing, trying to convince herself that the entire experience meant nothing. By the next morning, she had almost succeeded. Almost. The next day began with a diplomatic lunch involving the Krell. And if the Odal Tyran were cold intellectual perfection, the Krell were the exact opposite. Huge reptilian aliens, covered in dark scales, too many teeth, too many muscles, and a culture built around brute strength hidden beneath a thin layer of diplomacy. Oruza had spent months negotiating a trade agreement with them. This lunch was supposed to be the final step before the official signing. Everything needed to go perfectly. Tomas stood near the entrance of the banquet hall as usual. Silent. Watching everyone. Analyzing threats. He noticed that Oruza was avoiding eye contact with him even more than before. But he assumed she was simply focused on the negotiations. The lunch itself was painfully formal. The Krell devoured food with the elegance of wild animals. Oruza responded with perfectly calculated diplomatic phrases. Everyone pretended to be civilized. Everyone pretended to trust each other. And then everything exploded. The first blast shook the eastern side of the station. Tomas reacted instantly. Years of combat training took over before conscious thought could even catch up. He moved directly toward Oruza while his hand reached for the weapon at his waist. The second explosion came closer. Lights flickered. The floor vibrated. Then came the heat. Not gradually. Not slowly. Suddenly. Like someone had opened the door to the largest furnace in the universe. Within minutes, the temperature inside the station began climbing fast. Too fast. People started shouting. Emergency alarms activated across the corridor systems. Someone had sabotaged the cooling network. For Tomas, it was uncomfortable. Sweat formed immediately across his forehead, but humans handle heat fairly well. For the Krell, it was irritating but manageable. Their reptilian biology tolerated high temperatures. But for the Odal Tyran, it was deadly. Tomas looked at Oruza and immediately understood something was very wrong. Her skin had lost all color. Not pale. Gray. Sickly gray. Her movements became unstable. The perfect precision she always carried was disappearing. Her breathing turned shallow. Her eyes struggled to focus. The heat was killing her. Tomas grabbed her arm without asking permission. No time for protocol. We need to leave now. She tried to resist. Tried to continue discussing the treaty. Tried to maintain diplomatic composure. But Tomas was already moving, pulling her toward the emergency exit while panic spread across the banquet hall. The station corridors were worse. Every sector they crossed felt hotter than the last. Emergency systems were failing everywhere. Smoke drifted through the ventilation shafts. People were running. Some screaming. Some collapsing. Oruza stumbled every few steps. Tomas could feel her body weakening. Then she nearly fell completely. That was enough. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms and started running. And as he ran, his body went into survival mode. Muscles working at maximum capacity. Heart pounding. breathing hard, sweat pouring off him faster than ever before, far more than in the gym. The heat coated his skin instantly. Sweat dripped from his face, his neck, his arms, onto Oruza herself, and with every desperate breath she took, she inhaled him. The smell of exertion, stress, protection, strength. Something ancient deep inside her mind reacted immediately. Something primal. Something terrifying. It liked this. No. It needed this. Meanwhile, Tomos knew none of that. He was focused on survival. On protecting her. Nothing else. After what felt like forever, they finally reached an emergency shelter near one of the lower maintenance sectors. Tomos sealed the door behind them and carefully lowered Oruza onto the floor. The small room was barely functional. Dim lights. Emergency oxygen. Manual controls. But the cooling system wasn't active. Tomos checked the panel quickly. Locked. Damaged. The manual override needed to be activated from outside the shelter. Of course it did. Stay here, he said immediately. I'll be back in 1 minute. Oruza barely responded. She was delirious now, murmuring things in her native language. Equations mixed with fragmented poetry. Tomos stepped back into the hallway. The heat outside was brutal. 40 degrees. Maybe more. Possibly enough to kill a human eventually too. He found the emergency control panel halfway melted into the wall. Sweat dripped constantly from his body onto the damaged electronics while he forced the override system open. His vision blurred. His breathing grew heavier. But finally, the auxiliary cooling system activated. Cold air rushed through the shelter vents. Tomos leaned against the wall for one exhausted second before returning inside. The moment the shelter door sealed behind him again, he collapsed against the opposite wall trying to recover his breath. He was soaked completely, head to toe. The small emergency room instantly filled with his scent. Human sweat. Adrenaline. Stress hormones. Exhaustion. Everything his body had released during that desperate rescue. Several minutes passed in silence. Then Oruza spoke, and the words that came next changed both of their lives forever. Bodyguard matter, she said carefully, still staring at the ceiling. There is something I must tell you. Tomos looked over at her. Her voice sounded different. Less controlled. Almost nervous. My training and my culture require that this information remain secret, she continued. However, given the possibility that we may die here, I believe protocol has become irrelevant. Tomos suddenly had a very bad feeling about where this conversation was going. Oruza finally turned toward him. Millions of years ago, she said slowly, my species were prey animals. Tomos blinked. That was not where he expected this story to go. We survived because stronger species protected us. Over time, our biology evolved specialized receptors designed to identify the ideal protector. She paused. Her breathing remained uneven. When those receptors identified a suitable mate, our bodies initiated a permanent bond. Tomos stared at her silently. Oruza continued. My civilization believed those instincts had become vestigial, ancient evolutionary leftovers with no remaining function. Her violet eyes locked onto his. For millions of years, no Odal Tyran ever activated those receptors again. Another pause. Then quietly. Until now. Tomos swallowed slowly. I'm sorry, he said carefully. Are you telling me? I am telling you, Oruza interrupted softly, that my biology has selected you as my ideal partner. Silence. Pure silence. Tomos processed the sentence once. Then again. Neither attempt helped. Oruza kept speaking. The scent of your physical exertion, your sweat, activated receptors inside my nervous system that had remained dormant for millions of years. Her skin darkened purple again. Every time I inhale your scent, my body releases neurochemical responses that strengthen the bond. She looked genuinely horrified. As you humans say, I appear to be biologically in love with you. Tomos stared at her for several long seconds. An alien diplomat who had ignored his existence for weeks was now calmly explaining that his sweat had triggered an ancient mating instinct. Honestly, he preferred combat zones. he finally said. With respect, why me? Oruza frowned slightly. It was a logical question. A good question. You are correct, she admitted. I have encountered many humans aboard this station. Maintenance workers, engineers, cargo technicians. She looked confused now. None produced this reaction. Tomas rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe it's diet. No. Hygiene products. Standardized among all human personnel. Genetics. Inconclusive. For several minutes they continued eliminating possibilities one after another. Nothing explained why Tomas was different. Until he casually mentioned something seemingly unimportant. Well, there is one thing. Oruza looked at him immediately. What thing? Tomas shrugged. Before sleeping, I listened to stories on my tablet. Stories? Yeah. Science fiction stories. Human stories mostly.
A Channel Kayed están aquí.
Oruza stared at him blankly. And this matters because? I don't know, Tomas admitted. But I've listened every night for almost 2 years. Maybe it affects mood or something. Oruza became silent. Thinking. Analyzing. It sounded ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. But scientifically, it was still the only variable they had not eliminated. It is theoretically possible, she said slowly, that repeated exposure to stories involving human dominance, survival, and victory could alter neurological activity. Tomas blinked. You're saying I became attractive because I listened to cool human stories before bed? I am saying, Oruza replied with complete seriousness, that it is currently our leading hypothesis. And that was the exact moment someone slammed violently against the shelter door to T-First. I only visited Mr. Ducky once every few weeks. Then once every few days. Eventually, almost every day. The villagers stopped trying to stop me after a while. Once the harvests became larger and the food stores fuller, fear of the forest slowly faded. Parents still warned their children not to wander too deep among the trees, but nobody looked at me strangely anymore when I walked toward the woods carrying baskets of berries or fresh bread. In fact, most of them smiled. Some even asked me to thank Mr. Ducky for them. I always did. The forest no longer frightened me the way it once had. I began noticing things I had ignored during my first terrified journey inside. The sunlight filtering through the branches. The smell of pine and damp earth after rain. The strange broken shapes buried beneath moss and roots. Some of them were enormous. Metal structures hidden beneath the soil like the bones of sleeping giants. Sometimes I would place my hand against them and wonder what the world must have looked like when the old ones were still alive. Loud, probably. And bright. Mr. Ducky always guided me safely through the trees with soft blue lights that floated just above the ground. They reminded me of little stars dancing between the roots. Whenever I reached the clearing, his calm voice always greeted me. Welcome back, Scala. Every single time. Eventually, I decided the clearing needed improvement. You cannot continue sitting out in the rain, I told him one afternoon while dragging a bundle of wooden poles into the clearing. I do not require shelter, Mr. Ducky replied immediately. I ignored him. The canopy took nearly the entire afternoon to build. I tied together branches, stretched woven cloth across the top, then reinforced the corners with heavy stones so the wind wouldn't carry it away. Mr. Ducky remained completely silent the entire time. Only after I finished did he finally speak. It is acceptable. I burst out laughing. You were going to say you liked it. I was not. You absolutely were. I was not. That only made me laugh harder. And though his voice never changed, somehow I could tell he didn't mind. Those afternoons in the forest slowly became my favorite part of life. Sometimes I brought food and ate while talking to him. Sometimes I simply sat cross-legged in the grass telling him about village gossip while he listened patiently. Mostly, though, I asked questions. Endless questions. What were the old ones like? Why did they build machines like you? Were their cities bigger than mountains? Did they really travel between stars? Mr. Ducky answered every question carefully, patiently, as though he enjoyed remembering. They were curious people, he once told me, and very loud. I smiled. That sounds familiar. Another long pause. Yes, he admitted. It does. He told me stories about oceans larger than entire kingdoms, about metal ships capable of crossing worlds, about lights so bright they turned night into day. The old ones sounded impossible. Too advanced. Too powerful. Too alive. Which only made one question bother me more and more over time. What happened to them? The first time I asked, Mr. Ducky went silent for almost 5 whole minutes. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Then finally he answered quietly. They fought a war. With who? A great enemy. Did they win? Another long pause followed. They ensured your people would survive. That was not an answer. Even as a teenager, I recognized avoidance when I heard it. But the sadness in his voice stopped me from pushing further. So instead, I simply sat beside him quietly beneath the canopy while rain tapped softly against the cloth overhead. Sometimes silence felt important too. Years passed faster than I expected. I grew taller. Stronger. The village grew with me. New homes appeared along the riverbank. Farmers expanded the fields farther into the valley. Traders from neighboring settlements began visiting regularly to exchange tools and livestock for our crops. We even built our first blacksmith shop. And through all of it, Mr. Ducky watched over us silently from the forest. One evening after helping my mother harvest berries, I carried a freshly woven basket into the woods as a gift for him. You cannot consume berries, he pointed out when I placed it on top of his smooth metal surface. I know, I replied. Then why bring them? I sat down beside him with a grin. In case you ever decide to start. Silence. Then. Thank you. That tiny pause before he said the words made my chest ache strangely. Machines were not supposed to sound lonely. But Mr. Ducky did sometimes. Especially at night. One evening, after I finished telling him about a village festival, he suddenly asked me something he had never asked before. Do your people prosper? The question caught me off guard. I looked around the clearing thoughtfully before answering. Yes. I smiled softly. The harvests are strong. Nobody goes hungry anymore. The children laugh all the time now. I glanced toward him. You did that. His reply came slowly. I wish to leave behind a legacy worth preserving. The way he said it sent a strange chill through me. Leave behind. I repeated. What does that mean? For a long moment, only the sound of wind through the trees answered me. Then Mr. Ducky finally spoke. Time damages all things, Scala, even machines. I frowned. But you haven't changed at all. Not in ways your eyes can detect. The blue lights beneath his surface dimmed slightly. There may come a day when I can no longer protect this place. Fear twisted sharply inside my chest. You mean break? Yes. The word hit me harder than expected. For some reason, I had never imagined Mr. Ducky could disappear. He had always been there. Always waiting in the forest. Always protecting us. The idea of losing him suddenly felt unbearable. But who would hurt us? I asked quietly. We haven't done anything wrong. Mr. Ducky did not answer immediately. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded colder than usual. The universe does not require reasons. I walked home that night feeling uneasy. The world suddenly felt much larger than before. And much more dangerous. I got my answer 3 weeks later. The screaming started just before dawn. I woke instantly. At first I thought wolves had entered the village. Then I heard shouting outside and rushed toward the square with everyone else. A crowd had already gathered by the time I arrived. People stood frozen in horror around one of the village runners. Harrod. He had collapsed near the well. Large sections of his scales looked horribly burned away, exposing raw flesh beneath. Smoke still rose from parts of his clothing. His breathing came in weak, ragged gasps as he clawed desperately at the dirt. The demons, he croaked. Villagers knelt beside him in panic. What happened? Who attacked you? Harrod's eyes rolled wildly. Purple demons. His body suddenly jerked violently. Then went still. Complete silence fell over the village. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. I had seen death before, But not like that. Not burned. Not terrified. The council gathered immediately. Fear spread through the village faster than fire through dry grass. People argued loudly inside the meeting hall while others packed belongings in case we needed to flee. And once again, every eye turned toward me. "You must ask the machine," Elder Varon said grimly. Harrod's grandmother sat nearby trembling silently, tears running down her face. "Find out what killed him," she whispered. So before sunset, I loaded Harrod's body onto a wooden sled and dragged it toward the forest alone. The moment I crossed the tree line, blue lights appeared instantly. But this time, they felt different. Sharper. More urgent. The forest itself seemed tense somehow. When I reached the clearing, Mr. Ducky spoke before I could say a word. "Place the body on the platform." His voice sounded colder than I had ever heard before. I obeyed immediately. The circular platform rose silently from beneath the earth. Together, we carefully slid Harrod onto the metal surface. Then the platform descended underground. The earth closed behind it. I stood there trembling. What happened to him? I asked quietly. For several long seconds, only distant forest sounds answered me. Then the ground beneath my feet began vibrating. A deep metallic rumble echoed somewhere far below the earth. The blue lights across Mr. Ducky's surface slowly brightened. When he finally spoke again, his voice no longer sounded gentle. "An enemy you were never meant to encounter." The impact against the shelter door was so strong the metal bent inward. Then came another hit. And another. Heavy. Violent. Deliberate. Tomas stood up immediately. Every trace of exhaustion disappeared from his body in an instant. Combat instincts took over. He moved directly between Oruza and the entrance without even thinking about it. Oruza watched him silently from the floor. Something deep inside her reacted hard to that movement. Protector. The ancient part of her mind loved that word. The shelter door exploded inward. 3 Krell soldiers stormed into the room. Huge reptilian bodies. Dark scales. Curved combat blades designed for close-range killing. Their diplomatic clothing was gone now. This was no misunderstanding. No accident. The station sabotage had been an assassination attempt from the beginning. The largest Krell stepped forward slowly. "The human moves aside," he growled. "We only require the diplomat." Tomas didn't move. Didn't answer. Didn't negotiate. The first Krell attacked instantly. Fast. Faster than most humans could react. Tomas reacted anyway. The blade came toward his throat. He redirected the wrist. Twisted the arm. And the sound of snapping bone filled the shelter. The Krell screamed. Tomas ripped the weapon from his hand and drove an elbow directly into the alien's jaw hard enough to drop 200 kilos of reptilian muscle onto the floor. The second attacker lunged immediately after. Tomas stepped forward instead of backward. Headbutt. A brutal crack echoed through the room. The Krell's nose collapsed instantly. Before the alien could recover, Tomas drove his shoulder into his chest and slammed him against the wall hard enough to dent the metal. The third Krell froze. For the first time since entering the shelter, fear appeared in his eyes. Humans weren't supposed to move like this. Not exhausted humans. Not overheated humans. Not civilians. Tomas looked terrifying. Sweat-covered. Bleeding slightly from one eyebrow. Breathing heavily. Eyes completely focused. The third Krell turned to run. Tomas did not allow that. He crossed the distance in 2 steps. The fight ended seconds later. 30 seconds. That was all it took. 30 seconds of control violence. Efficient. Brutal. Protective. Then silence returned to the shelter. Tomas stood there breathing heavily. Sweat poured down his arms. Across his chest. Down his neck. Fresh adrenaline flooded his system. The air inside the small room became even thicker with his scent. Human stress hormones. Combat pheromones. Protective aggression. Everything his body produced during violence. Oruza stared at him from the floor. Completely frozen. And inside her mind, something ancient spoke again. Yes. This one. This is the protector. This is the male who keeps you alive. Every instinct she possessed screamed the same thing now. Chosen. Tomas finally looked back toward her. You okay? The question sounded absurd considering the bodies on the floor, but Aruza barely noticed the dead attackers anymore. She was staring at him, at the sweat running down his skin, at the way his chest rose and fell after combat, at the way he instinctively positioned himself between danger and her. Bodyguard matter, she said softly. Her voice no longer sounded cold, no longer distant, no longer controlled. My mind is deeply ashamed of what I am about to say. Tomas suddenly looked nervous again, but my biological instincts demand honesty. She slowly stood up, still weak from the heat, still shaking slightly, and yet unable to stop herself. I have developed an overwhelming desire. She hesitated, actually hesitated. An Odal Tyran almost never hesitated while speaking. To kiss you. Tomas blinked. Aruza continued before she lost courage. I also feel a strong instinct to prepare your meals. Tomas stared. And call you repeatedly during the day for conversations that accomplish absolutely nothing. Tomas looked genuinely confused now. Wait, what? Aruza covered part of her face in visible embarrassment. These behaviors appear connected to long-term pair bonding rituals. Tomas was still covered in alien blood and sweat. This was probably not the most romantic situation in galactic history. High Scholar Aruza, he began carefully. Yes, Tomas, she interrupted quietly. I believe I am in love with you. The silence after that felt almost unreal. Tomas looked at her carefully. And for the first time since taking this assignment, he stopped seeing her as just another client. Because the truth was, he had felt something too. From the very beginning. Not biological obsession. Not ancient instincts. But something. The need to protect her had gone beyond professionalism a long time ago. He simply never admitted it to himself. I should probably be honest too, he said slowly. Aruza looked up immediately. When I'm around you, I feel responsible for you. Her violet eyes widened slightly. I know that sounds stupid. It does not. I keep thinking about whether you're safe, whether you've eaten, whether someone might try to hurt you. Aruza's skin shifted softly toward purple again. And when the station started collapsing, Tomas continued, the only thing I cared about was getting you out alive. Aruza stepped closer. Very close now. This relationship would violate countless social taboos in my civilization, she whispered. I know. My reputation would be destroyed. I know. There would be political consequences. Probably. And yet, she said quietly, after analyzing the situation logically, I find no reason not to choose you. Tomas looked at her for several long seconds, then smiled slightly. Well, he said, this is definitely the weirdest day of my life. For the first time since he met her, Aruza laughed. A real laugh. Soft. Small. Beautiful. Then she kissed him. Carefully at first. Almost uncertain. As if she was experiencing emotion for the very first time. Then more confidently. More intensely. Millions of years of emotional suppression collapsing all at once. And honestly, Tomas kissed her back immediately. Several minutes later, rescue teams finally reached the shelter. The emergency door opened. Captain Melusa entered first. Head of Aruza's personal security detail. Another Odal Tyran. Tall. Elegant. Perfect posture. Perfect emotional control. At least. Until she stepped inside the room. Because the shelter air was still completely saturated with Tomas. Hours of stress. Combat. Sweat. Adrenaline. The smell hit her instantly. Melusa froze mid-step. Her pupils expanded violently. Her skin flashed purple. Aruza recognized the symptoms immediately. Oh no, she whispered. Melusa grabbed the wall for support. High Scholar, she said weakly. I believe something is wrong with me. Tomas slowly looked between both alien women. What? Melusa inhaled again accidentally. Big mistake. Her knees almost gave out. The smell, she whispered. The human. Aruza closed her eyes in exhausted disbelief. because she already knew exactly what was happening. And unfortunately, so did the ancient instincts buried deep inside Melusa's brain. Captain Melusa was in trouble. Serious trouble. Tomas could see it immediately. Her breathing had become uneven. Her normally controlled posture was collapsing. And her violet eyes kept drifting toward him no matter how hard she tried to resist. The air inside the shelter was still heavy with his scent. Human sweat. Adrenaline. Protective aggression. Everything produced by a human body after extreme combat and stress. 4-odal Tyran biology. Apparently that combination was catastrophic. Melusa pressed herself against the wall. "What is happening to me?" she whispered. Oruza looked deeply tired already. Not physically. Emotionally. Because she knew this conversation was about to become incredibly awkward. "Captain," Oruza said carefully, "I need you to remain calm while I explain something extremely important." Melusa swallowed hard, then inhaled again by accident. Another mistake. Her skin instantly darkened to purple. "Oh no." Tomas slowly raised one hand. "Okay, before anyone says anything crazy again, I just want to point out that I'm standing right here." Neither alien answered him. Oruza continued. "Millions of years ago, our species evolved biological receptors designed to identify ideal protectors." Melusa's eyes widened in horror. "No." "Yes." "No." "Yes." Melusa looked at Tomas again. That was an even worse mistake, because now she noticed everything. The blood on his arms, the sweat on his neck, the signs of recent combat, the smell of effort and protection surrounding him. And deep inside her nervous system, ancient instincts activated completely. A powerful wave of emotion hit her all at once. Safety, protection, attachment, bonding. Her knees nearly failed again. "This is impossible," she whispered. "It should be," Oruza admitted. "But unfortunately, it is not." Tomas rubbed both hands across his face. "Can someone explain this in normal human language?" Oruza sighed. "Your sweat appears to trigger ancient mating instincts in our species." Tomas pointed at Melusa. "And her too." "Yes." "And this happened because I carried you through a burning station while sweating everywhere." "Yes." Tomas stared blankly for several seconds, then nodded slowly. "Honestly, I've heard weirder things during military service." Melusa looked deeply offended by that answer. "This is not amusing," she said weakly. "My biological systems are experiencing severe pair bonding impulses." Tomas blinked. "Meaning?" Melusa looked away immediately, meaning she absolutely did not want to answer that question. Oruza answered instead. "She wants to stay close to you." Melusa's skin turned darker purple. "She wants physical affection from you." Darker purple. "She probably also wants to cook for you." Melusa covered her face instantly. "This is humiliating." Tomas looked genuinely overwhelmed now. "Wait, so now both of you are biologically attached to me?" The two alien women exchanged an uncomfortable look. "It is complicated," Oruza admitted. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed calmly. "It is not." Melusa slowly lowered her hands from her face. Her expression became more serious. "High Scholar," she said carefully, "this situation cannot become public." "Obviously. If the Diplomatic Council discovers that both of us activated ancestral bonding responses toward the same human." Oruza nodded grimly. "It would become a political catastrophe." Tomas folded his arms. "Why?" Both women looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "Because," Oruza explained patiently, "you are technically my bonded partner now." Tomas blinked. "Already?" "Our biology moves quickly." "That's mildly terrifying." Melusa groaned softly and leaned harder against the wall. "The problem," Oruza continued, "is that bonded partners are not supposed to trigger additional pair responses in other odal Tyran." Tomas pointed toward himself again. "So biologically, I'm basically illegal now." In extremely simplified terms. "Yes." Melusa closed her eyes. "My career is over." Oruza nodded sympathetically. My reputation is already collapsing. Tomas looked between them. Okay. New question. Both women looked at him. Why me specifically? That question silenced the room again. Because, honestly, they still didn't fully know. Oruza crossed her arms thoughtfully. We eliminated most variables already. Diet. Not unique. Hygiene products. Standardized. Genetics. Inconclusive. Tomas suddenly snapped his fingers. The stories. Both women looked at him. The stories I listened to before sleeping. Oruza frowned slightly. The Human Science Fiction Channel. Yeah.
Están aquí.
Melusa looked confused. You consume fictional narratives recreationally before unconsciousness. Tomas shrugged. Humans do that. Oruza's analytical side immediately returned. Repeated emotional stimulation. Melusa continued the thought automatically. Could alter hormonal balance. Which affects pheromone production. Tomas pointed at them. So your scientific conclusion is that alien women are becoming obsessed with me because I listen to cool human stories before bed. Both women remained silent for a moment. Then Oruza answered calmly. At present, yes. Tomas sat down slowly. That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. And yet, Oruza replied, the evidence currently supports it. Melusa suddenly inhaled sharply again. Tomas looked toward her immediately. You okay? Big mistake. Direct concern from him hit her nervous system like a weapon. Her skin flashed purple so intensely it almost glowed. Oh, this is bad, she whispered. The bonding response was getting stronger. Fast. Melusa took a shaky breath. High Scholar, every minute near him appears to intensify the attachment. Tomas looked alarmed now. That sounds medically dangerous. It is emotionally dangerous, Oruza corrected. Politically dangerous. Socially catastrophic. Melusa looked absolutely miserable. There must be a solution. Oruza became quiet, thinking carefully. Then slowly, very slowly, she looked toward Tomas. There may be one possibility. Tomas immediately hated the sound of that sentence. What possibility? Oruza folded her hands behind her back. If the biological reaction is truly connected to human pheromones altered through repeated exposure to those fictional stories. Tomas narrowed his eyes. Then theoretically another compatible human could exist. Melusa looked up instantly. Another hope appeared in her expression. You mean another human capable of activating the bond? Yes. Tomas understood immediately. Oh no. Oruza nodded calmly. Yes. Melusa stepped closer now despite trying not to. We need another subscriber. Tomas stared at them. You cannot be serious. Oruza looked completely serious. If another human possesses similar biochemical markers. The bond could transfer, Melusa finished desperately. Tomas rubbed his forehead. So somewhere out there, he said slowly, is another poor idiot listening to space stories before bed without realizing he's accidentally becoming biologically irresistible to alien women. Both women answered at exactly the same time. Yes. Silence. Then Tomas sighed deeply. This galaxy is insane. Station-wide emergency announcements echoed through the corridor outside. The sabotage investigation had officially begun. And very soon. The entire station would learn what happened inside the shelter. The station entered full lockdown 3 hours later. Security drones flooded the corridors. Emergency crews repaired damaged cooling systems. Diplomatic officials screamed at each other across encrypted channels. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, Tomas sat inside a private medical chamber while 2 alien scientists studied his sweat like it was a sacred artifact. This is humiliating, he muttered. It is scientifically fascinating, one researcher corrected immediately. That's somehow worse. Behind the glass wall, Oruza and Melusa stood watching the examination. Or at least trying to. Every few minutes one of them would accidentally inhale too deeply and visibly lose concentration again. Neither woman was handling the situation well. which was ironic, because the Odal Tyran were famous across the galaxy for emotional discipline. Now two of their highest-ranking representatives could barely remain calm near one sweaty human. The scandal potential alone was enough to destroy governments. Inside the lab, another scientist approached carefully. We have completed the phenomenal comparison. Tomas looked up. And? The scientist adjusted his scanner. Your biological output is abnormal. That's not comforting. We detected elevated hormonal markers associated with aggression control, protective instincts, emotional resilience, and reward stimulation. Tomas blinked. So, military training? Partially. The scientist hesitated. However, there are additional neurological patterns we cannot fully explain. Oruza immediately focused. What kind of patterns? The scientist turned toward her. The human subject displays unusually synchronized emotional stimulation during rest cycles. Tomas frowned. What? The scientist activated a holographic screen. We examined his neural activity logs from personal device usage. Tomas suddenly looked nervous. You checked my tablet. It was necessary. That feels illegal. No laws currently cover this situation. Fair enough. The scientist continued. Every night before sleep, the subject consumes narrative content involving human survival superiority, interspecies conflict, heroic dominance, and protective behavior. Melusa looked toward Tomas slowly. The stories. The scientist nodded. We believe prolonged emotional immersion may have altered subconscious hormonal responses over time. Tomas stared blankly. So listening to cool space stories before bed literally changed my sweat. In simplified terms. Yes. Tomas leaned back in his chair. That is the single dumbest scientific science often sounds ridiculous before becoming accepted fact, Oruza replied calmly. Tomas pointed toward himself. So now I'm basically a biological weapon. The scientist potentially. That is not reassuring. Outside the laboratory, station officials were already panicking. Because rumors had started spreading. Fast. Very fast. The Odal Tyran delegation was behaving strangely. Their chief diplomat refused to leave her human bodyguard. Her security captain kept volunteering for nearby assignments. And both women reportedly changed skin color every time the human entered the room. Unfortunately, people noticed. Especially the Krell. Hours later, inside one of the station's diplomatic chambers, several reptilian officials argued loudly with security commanders. The human is dangerous, one Krell snarled. He eliminated 3 trained warriors alone. He defended himself, a station officer replied. He corrupted 2 Odal Tyran females. That is apparently not intentional. The Krell leader slammed his claws against the table. That makes it worse. And honestly, he had a point. Because intentional seduction could be understood. But accidental biological domination through sweat? That terrified people. Meanwhile, Tomas had problems of his own. Mainly because Oruza and Melusa were now both sitting across from him in his private quarters. Awkwardly. Very awkwardly. Nobody knew the correct social rules for this situation. Tomas finally broke the silence. So. Both alien women immediately looked at him. We should probably establish boundaries. Melusa inhaled sharply again. Still a mistake. Oruza closed her eyes briefly in frustration. This is becoming difficult. You think. Tomas leaned forward. Look, I'm trying my best here, but this whole biological soulmate thing is a lot to process. That is understandable, Oruza admitted. Melusa nodded quietly. Tomas continued. And now apparently the solution is finding another human who listens to those stories. Yes, both women answered together again. Tomas sighed. Right. The room became silent for several seconds. Then Melusa spoke very softly. There may not be much time. Tomas looked toward her. The bonding instinct continues increasing. Oruza's expression darkened slightly. She is correct. What happens if you don't find someone? Neither woman answered immediately. Which was not encouraging. Eventually Oruza spoke. The emotional fixation may become difficult to suppress. Tomas blinked slowly. Define difficult. Melusa looked away. That is not a conversation I wish to have while conscious. Fair enough. Tomas stood up and started pacing. Okay. Fine. Then we find another subscriber. Melusa looked hopeful immediately. Oruza remained cautious. That may not be easy. Why? The station has over 40 species, Oruza explained. Humans represent less than 3% of the population. And among those humans, Melusa added, only a fraction would regularly consume those specific stories. Tomas nodded slowly. So basically we need to find one very specific nerd somewhere on this giant station before your biology completely destroys intergalactic diplomacy. Yes, Oruza replied calmly. When you say it like that, Tomas muttered, this somehow feels even worse. Suddenly, the station intercom activated. Attention all personnel. The voice echoed through every corridor. This is Director Vakar of Station Security. Tomas stopped walking immediately. We are currently investigating reports regarding a potentially hazardous human biological phenomenon. Tomas closed his eyes. Oh no. The announcement continued. All human personnel are temporarily ordered to report for biochemical screening. Melusa looked horrified. Oruza looked even worse. Because they both realized the same thing instantly. If the station started testing human pheromones, they might accidentally create dozens more cases. Tomas stared at both women in disbelief. Tell me I'm wrong. Neither of them answered. And that silence terrified him more than the explosions earlier.